If you work with JavaScript, you will inevitably have used console.log, but you may not be taking full advantage of the console if that's all you've used. The console actually has more than 20 different methods you can use to manage the output. Let's take a look at the essentials and then some of the more useful, lesser known methods that even an experienced developer might have missed. Before we jump into that though, be sure to subscribe for more programming tutorials, and if you're interested in a newsletter about building and scaling software from the team here at BetterStack, go ahead and sign up for the Hacking Scale newsletter. A link will be in the description down below. Now let's take a look at console logging. So to start out, I'm going to be showing you the console logs using the Chrome DevTools. All of these methods will work with Node.js as well though, but the DevTools are good for a nice interactive console. But we're going to start at the basics here with the most common method of console.log. All we have to do is type in console.log here, and then we can provide it with whatever we want. This could be a variable, or we can just do it in line like so. So we could do hello world. When I go ahead and save this, what you'll see is it's going to print out to the console immediately because I'm currently running this in dev mode. So this script is always going to rerun when I save. But you can see when my script has run, it now says hello world in the console. And it also gives me some nice information here, which is that it came from the main.js file, line 1, which you can see we're in main.js here, and line 1 there was this console.log. So it gives you a bit of information about where it's been run. Now, as I said before, this could actually be a variable as well. So if I did something like const x and then make this equal to world here and go ahead and save that, and then let's say I print out x itself, what you can see is we can print out the value of that variable. So this is super useful for nice quick checks to make sure you're getting what you expected from one of your variables. But we could also add a message before this like so. So we can go back and let's say we label this as hello. You can actually just place a comma here and it will go ahead and put a space in there for you. So what you can see is we get hello world. The other thing you may be tempted to do with this though is just do hello plus x. Obviously this is going to work, but you're going to have to add a space here, and then that will print out nicely. But the other method we could take advantage of is just string substitution. So let's say I wanted to do hello world again. If I now just put %s here, like so, and then I put an x here, what it will do is it will replace the %s with the order of the values that we put here. So if I now put hello and then world like so, you'll go ahead and save that. You'll see this is actually rerun, but it hasn't changed the value there because it's the exact same. So if I change this to hello world 1, you'll see again, we're getting hello, and then it's replacing this string here with what we put there. Again, if I did another %s, and then let's say I put something like how are you here, you'll go ahead and you'll see it's just going to go in order of how we put them here. So if I save that, it's going to print out hello world 1, how are you? So another couple cool tricks we can use there. Along with %s and string substitution, there is actually a few others that you can use. So you can actually use %i for integers or numbers here. So if I change this to something that can be passed as a number, so let's put it as 10, you'll see we're going to get hello 10. Now the reason you'll use this instead of a string, even though it comes out looking like a string here, is just if x was something that couldn't actually be passed as an integer, it will go ahead and print not a number for you instead of just going ahead and letting it go like it would if it was a string. So you can see there, it's just going to let it go and you won't get any sort of feedback that your number that was supposed to be a number isn't one in this console.log. So with the basics of console.log there covered, we can actually make these error messages a little bit more useful by utilizing error levels. Now, all of these functions are going to be able to use the same methods we used in that console.log, like the string substitution, but we can just provide a little more context. First, I'm going to start out with a console.log here, and I'm just going to call this a basic log. If I go to the next line though, and I do a console.info, so this is a new one, and we're going to call this one info log like so. If I save this so it runs, what you see is they're going to look like the exact same message type essentially. And that's because console.log is going to be info by default. What you can see here is this is going to be our normal message. Now you'd use the info level when you want to specify something about the normal operation of your application. So maybe you're running a function and you literally just want to put a console.info that says this function ran or something like that. The difference that some people determine from console.log is when you're debugging, you put a lot of console.logs around. So we use console.info. You may use it in a way that essentially specifies, I mean this to be here. Don't delete this. Maybe once you're done debugging, I mean for this message to be there. So that's a way that I've seen people use console.info versus console.log there. The next one we can utilize is actually console.warn here. And if I just say warning in here and we save this, you're going to see that Chrome is going to print this out a little bit differently. And it's going to indicate that we have a warning. And again, you can see that there's a warning message with this. Now in Chrome, we actually get a stack trace, so you can see where it came from. And again, that was just main line 3 there. If there was more advanced functions, it would show you each function that was called, but we'll get onto that a little bit later with the console.trace method. Now console.warn you would use when you want to essentially warn the user or whoever's looking through it that essentially something that has happened that may lead to an error in the future or something unexpected happening in the application. application. Now, if that then does happen, so something like an error has happened, we can utilize console.error here. And again, inside of here, I'm just going to type error like so. And you see again, Chrome is going to tell us up here on this nice indicator that we have one error. And we can go click in it and it's red and everything, it's been highlighted. And again, in Chrome, we're going to get a stack trace, and I'll look at that a bit later. But you can see how we can say this is now an error. And with console.error, again, you're going to use that when something has happened in your application that has gone wrong and it's outside of the normal operation of that application. So you absolutely didn't mean for it to happen. Another way as well is when you throw an error, you can use that in a try catch, and then you can just catch and then console.error the error that you get from that exception. Now, the last one we can use with error levels here is going to be console.debug like so. And if I type in debug here like this and go ahead and save, what you're going to notice is we're not actually going to see this message debug in the default console here. What we have to do is change the level of logs that we want to see. So we change this to verbose here. And what you'll see is we're going to get out that debug message. And I'm also using Vite to run my application, and it seems they have some debug messages as well. Now, where you want to use a debug message is essentially when you are debugging. That is the point of it. Maybe you don't want all of these console.logs normally when you're just looking through your application, but when you need to go and debug something a bit deeper, you can put console.debug messages around your application. That just means that when we do go in and debug, we can put on the verbose level and you can see a lot more information about what happened when you ran your application. Now, as I said earlier, these messages in Chrome, whether it's a warning or an error, actually come with their own stack trace. So you can see when we open this up, it was called by the anonymous function, which just means we called it itself, main.js line 3. Now, this is what's called a stack trace. Now, we can actually utilize this by doing console.trace, and that's going to print out the stack trace that got you to this message. So if I put something like hi in here, you're going to see that we're going to get that stack trace out. This isn't going to be a great example of why console.trace is super powerful though. If I go ahead and paste in these functions here and save this, what you can see is this is quite complex in that we have one function calling another, and then another function calling the other function, and then we're running both of those functions separately. What you can see with the console.trace here is we can actually see where these were called. So we start out in main.js line 6. So why did we get to this console.trace here? What you can see is on line 6 here, we called the function 1. That function 1 was then called on line 1, and then it called function 2, and then it called function 3, which is where we then got to our stack trace on line 4. And then you can see with the function 2, it was called on line 7 here. That went to function 2 instead, and then function 3. So you can see there that traces are best used when you're debugging, as they provide you the context of why your code was called. So it works really well when you have a function like this with complex conditions or a load of linked functions whose flow is a little bit hard or long to read in your code. You can use console.trace to just sort of cut through it and see why you got to a specific point in your application. So those methods there are what I would call the essentials of console logging, but these next few are going to be the lesser known and super useful ones. So the first one is going to be console.table. If I go ahead and replace all of this with an array of objects here, you can see we've got an ID, we've got a name, age, and occupation. If I now go ahead and use our basic console.log on this people one here, so if I do console.log and then people like so, if I go ahead and save this, you'll see we're going to get the array out, and we can also expand the objects inside of it. But there is actually going to be a nicer way to do this. If I replace this console.log with console.table like so, you can see we can really quickly turn this into a much nicer format, so you can see the information at a glance. So it's going to print out all of our properties and also give us the index here, and it's just going to get these names obviously from the properties of the objects, turning it into a table. The other cool thing we can do though is we can actually pass an array to this method, and that's going to be of the properties we want. So if I turn this into an array, and let's say I just want the name and then maybe just the age instead of the occupation here. So if I go ahead and get that out, you can see we've got people, name, and age. And what you can see here is it's going to change that table that we get out. Instead of having the occupation field, it's just going to have the index still. It's going to have the name and age. So you can select what properties you want in the table using this method here. Now, our next super helpful method is going to be console.count. This one's going to tell you how often something is happening, and you can provide it with a label as well. If I go ahead and replace what's in here with a function called greet, and then I go ahead and call this greet function, what you'll notice is I've got a console.count in here with a label of greet. If I now go ahead and let's say I greet world and then save this, what you're going to see is greet is called, and then we also have this one after it, and then hello world. This one here is actually the count of how many times it hit this line of code here. So we can use it to keep track of how many times a function has been called, for example. So if I went ahead and used greet again on this line, and let's say I do greet and then James, what you'll notice is every time we go through this, we're going to get a greet1 here. Then it's printing out what we had in this hello world there. And then it's going to be greet2 because this is now the second time the greet function has run, or at least the count has run with this label here. So obviously you could have multiple functions using the same count and the same label, but it's just quite useful to do it in this manner. The other thing you're going to want to know if you're using console.count is going to be console.countReset. With console.countReset, all you have to do is provide it with the same label that you provided to the count that you want to reset to 0 now. So inside of here, we can now put in greet. Now, if I go ahead and just use one greet down here, so I'll just copy and paste my greet James and save that. What you're going to notice in the console is we're getting that greet1 in that console.count, and then we're getting that hello world greet2. And then when we do the count reset, when we do our next greet, that counter goes back to 0. So as I said there, that is count, and that's really useful to keep track on how many times a function is being called and various other things. Next up, we can use console.time to measure how long our code is taking. So maybe you have a complex loop or an algorithm and you want to see what improvements you can make to it or what part is actually slowing down your application. Similar to count, we can also label these as well. So if I go ahead and I paste in something like a complex array here, what you can see is we've got a massive array. We're just filling it, and then we're just going to do a map over this. So this is going to take a little bit longer than a normal function would. If I go to above this now, what I can do is I can say console.time. In this time here, I can just say, let's say something like array operation, like so. And then at the end of the loop as well, I can say console and then .time end, like so. And then we can put in that exact same label that we passed it earlier, and then do console.array operation. If I go ahead and save this so it runs now, what you'll see is by the time all of this is done, we get a printout of exactly how long it took. So you can see there we can use it to time how long some complex operations took, just to get some really nice debugging information out there and find areas where we can make improvements. We can expand on this though by making a more complex application. So expanding on console.time with another example here, what I've got is I've got a for loop here, and then you can see I'm doing some nested timing. So I have my outer operation here with the outer operation label with console.time, and then I end that down here. But then for each of the for loop ones, I also want to see how long each individual one takes. So I can nest a console.time operation here with console.time inner operation, and then the index we're on, and then also end it down here. And you see I'm just simulating, let's say, something a little bit complex. If I go ahead and save this now, what you can see is we get the inner operation first, so the first one, that took 7 milliseconds, 6 milliseconds, and then right at the end, we can see how long the entire thing took to do all of these inner operations together. The other really cool one we could do, instead of doing a console.time inner operation, inside of the for loop, we can actually log out where we're at on our current console.time. So if I go ahead and instead of doing this, I use console.time_log, like so. Within this time log function now, what I can actually do is I can firstly just say with the label that we need, so that one's going to be outer operation, but then I can provide it with additional context here. So I could also put I here for the index. If I go ahead and save this now, you'll see we're going to get something a little bit similar to what we had before. What you can see is we're seeing the outer operation timer here, but then we're seeing the current time we're at when we hit the current label we were on. So at the moment when I'm on the 0 index here, what you can see is my timer was going for 0.002 milliseconds. And then when we get to 1, we were running for 5 milliseconds, 11, and then the outer operation down here is just going to be the total. So time log there is just really useful when you want to see what your current timer is on without actually stopping it. So it's just going to tell you what stage you're at and that timer value. So now that you're a master at console logging, you may have quite a few, and you may want to start to group these. This is also really helpful when you want to do different stages of your application, like initializing when it's making API calls or various other things. You can actually use console.group. So if I come in here and I type in console and then .group, like so, we can give this a name. So I'm going to give my one a name of user details here. If I go ahead and save this now, what you'll notice is in Chrome DevTools here, I now have a nice collapsible group of my console log. So if I wanted to hide that and then look at some of the rest of them, I could go ahead and do that, and you can see they're all nested under this user details label. Now if I wanted to end this one, what I could do is I can say console.groupEnd. Now this is just going to end the group that this console.groupEnd is called it. So you don't need to provide it with a label or anything, as it's just going to pick up the closest one that it is in. And what you can see with this is now my user details are all nested under this label, but then I've got 2 here that are no longer in that group there. With this as well, we can actually do nested groups. So if I now do console.group, inside of this console.group, I can call this one, let's say, just additional, like so. If I go ahead and then add a console.groupEnd, let's say I add this at the end of this section here. So I do console.groupEnd, that's just going to end the one that we just created. So console.groupEnd, and then save that. What you now notice is I've got my user details, then I've also got my additional information, and then this occupation developer is outside of that group, but still in my user details group. So if I go ahead and collapse this one, you see that we have that user details label, and then these two here. Now, the other cool thing we can actually do is just change this to group collapsed. Now, group collapsed is just automatically by default going to be collapsed, so we don't have to do that ourselves. Then we can come in here and expand it if we wanted to, because as you've seen before, when we leave this with just group, Chrome actually goes ahead and expands it for us. So you can see with groups there, it's just really nice to add a little bit of additional context. And with the groups being collapsible as well, it just helps you clean up the console a bit. And as I said, a really good usage of that is maybe I'm at the initializing stage of my application. I can nest them all under sort of this header of initializing, and I can go in and see the console logs if I want to, or I could have another group later on for maybe when I'm making an API call in my application, and then I can expand that one if I want to. And these headers are just a nice place to put a bit of additional context as well. So for our last method here, again, it's going to be one that's going to help you clean up the console, and that's just going to be console.clear. So if I type in console.clear, what you'll see is it's just going to print out that the console was cleared, and it's cleared all of the messages that came before it. Now, this one is going to be really useful, again, if you're having something like those stages. So maybe, as I mentioned before, you have that initialization stage of your application, and you want to print out all of the console logs. But maybe once it completes that, you just want to clear the console, as if there was an error in there, maybe you'd throw the error, and it wouldn't hit this specific line. So you could have something like a try catch in that initializing stage, and if it does work, you go ahead and clear the console, but if it doesn't, you still print out your console logs. So that one there is just really useful when you just want to clear up the console a bit and don't want to have too many messages in there, so you can see when you're debugging what you actually want to focus on. So that there is the basics of JavaScript console logging and the cool methods we're able to use to enhance our logs. Now, it's worth noting with these, it's unlikely you want to use them in production, as it might be a lot of overhead on setting up your logs in a useful and consistent format. If you want to consider more advanced techniques, consider using a logging library like Winston. We have a video on that here. If not, check out the video YouTube thinks you'll like, and as always, subscribe, and thank you for watching.